All right, welcome everybody. I know this has been a long-awaited series that I wanted to start doing on my Patreon page, the intersection of philosophy and psychology. It's been of interest to me as a long-time, how do I say, patient on many a psychologist's couch. Since I was 16, actually, my 16 was the first time that I actually went to a therapist. I thought I needed some help. And it became sort of my mental gym until my 40s, until my mid 40s. But it wasn't until I really started incorporating philosophy into my life, and particularly the philosophy of objectivism, that I started to really notice improvements with respect to a lot of the problems that I had, mainly stemming from early trauma as a child. I was diagnosed with PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, not straight out depression, but I used to suffer from that quite a bit in my 20s. Most of those things have disappeared, and a general feeling of wellness is what I have now, and fearing no man is pretty much the way I feel now, which I attribute to philosophy. So I'm really honored to have Rick Repetti here with me. He is a philosopher. One of my favorite philosophers. He teaches philosophy at the City College of New York, right?
City University of New York.
City University, sorry, CUNY, City University of New York. He is friendly to objectivism, unlike a lot of academics out there. He sees the great value that Rand brought to philosophy, but he has an extensive knowledge about philosophy across the board, including Eastern philosophy and many of the techniques in Eastern philosophy that I think can really help people who are feeling stressed or have PTSD or have anxiety disorders that deal with being in crowds. And we're going to talk about some of those philosophies. I think we're going to talk about what the difference between psychology and philosophy is, because I'm sure one exists, and Rick will be able to explain it better than I. And how you can integrate the two, and/or which one could be the powerful influence in your life for making you feel better. So Rick, welcome. It's always great to see you. I miss you. I haven't seen you in a while, so I'm looking forward to being on the East Coast so I can break bread with you and the fam again. But let's talk a little bit about philosophy and psychology. Now, apparently there's a difference between the two. Now, can you define a difference between the two?
Sure. So most schools of psychology, although there's a kind of disintegration in that field, there's no kind of unifying, overarching framework yet, except a couple of people are working on that. One of them is a friend of mine named Greg Enriquez, brilliant theoretician and psychologist and a philosopher. But like the three major things that go on, well, in psychology, let's talk, I think you mean you want to narrow it down to psychotherapy is what you're talking about, right? Sure. So theoretical stuff is separate. Three basic features in a psychotherapeutic relationship are that the therapist wants to develop a kind of quality relationship with the client, because that's the container for trust and whatnot, to try to help work through the issues with the client, to generate an understanding of what's been going on with the client, what's happened, what should happen, and why, right? Ways in which the client can improve their life, and then generate tasks for the client or interventions that the therapist might effectuate change through to get the client to live a more adaptive, functional life, right? So this is, in general, psychotherapeutic approach is to fit people back into the cogs and the wheels of society, right? To, help them function on some basic functional level, right? Philosophy challenges the norms of society, right? And when a person comes in for philosophical counseling, for example, which is a new and growing thing, well, since around the 1990s, maybe even a little earlier, we chat, like one of Ayn Rand's basic questions that you find throughout a lot of her literature is, what's your premise, right? What's your premise? So philosophers challenge your basic fundamental assumptions, your values, your sense of self, your beliefs, your epistemology, what you think counts as knowledge, what you think is reality. If whether you're a relativist or no matter what kind of ideology or religion or set of hodgepodge of confused beliefs that you come in with, the therapist is supposed to kind of heal you, whereas the philosopher is supposed to really act like a philosophical prosthetic device to get you to become your own philosopher, right? And that might put you at odds at that. There's no goal of fitting you back into society necessarily. That may or may not be good. Depends on what your society is. If you're in a Nazi society or in communist China, it might not be good for you to be adjusted in such a way that you just fit right back into society. So philosophers are challenging clients in ways that we might actually even lose a client because they're not looking for that, you know, if they come to philosophical counseling.
I may be a little bit biased here, but that actually sounds a great deal more healthy. It seems like philosophy, psychology's attempt is to get you to conform on the presumption that the society that you're in is somehow the standard of the norm. I also wanted to ask you about transference, because that's something that you're supposed to experience with the psychologist, and I find that a very interesting concept. And yet philosophy is not about conforming, it's about finding your own individual truth. And if that means defying what is out there in the world, in the culture, then so much the better. Now, Ibsen famously said at the very end of Enemy of the People, the strongest man in the world is he who stands most alone. That's such a powerful concept to me, because it seems like philosophical counseling is telling you your independent mind and assessment of the world matters more than you agreeing with a consensus of whatever society happens to push out there.
Absolutely. And that reminded me of what Ayn Rand says, that the smallest minority is the individual. And our task in philosophical counseling is to try to help the individual recognize basic things like autonomy, right? What is this? There's one theory in psychology that I like, that in positive psychology, it's called self-determination theory. In self-determination theory, the idea is that human flourishing, and studies seem to support this, suggest that if these four things are going on in a person's life significantly, then they're experiencing flourishing or well-being. This is a conception of well-being that I like, because it doesn't necessarily fit in with the model that we were saying, put you back into the machinery of society. You have intrinsic interests, your own interests. You have autonomy. You are in charge of the decisions and actions that you perform, rather than someone who's micromanaged, let's just say, by an institution or a society. You have competence. We want to encourage people to cultivate their personal skills. These are expressions of their autonomy. So you could have great competence, but have a micromanager and you can't make decisions for yourself. You might have all sorts of autonomy, but you have no competence. So you need to cultivate skills, right? And then the last one is connection with others, because we are social beings, right? But it's not the altruism. It could be connection with a project that's meaningful to you, connection with meaningful others, other Randians. Well, it doesn't matter what they are, but human beings flourish when they have those four things going for them in general, right? So like that's one example of the kind of therapeutic intervention I might give with a client if they come to me confused, they have no radar, no magnetic north, they have no guiding principles. I can give them something like that. So this is a kind of generic framework that's turning them into an autonomous individual.
Right? And that's interesting. Do you notice a similarity between those four qualities that you're talking about and some of the, say, just a few of the 7 virtues of objectivism? I mean, rationality being one, which, to be rational, you need to be autonomous. You need to be a willful being acting in the interest of your own life. To be competent.
Reasoning on your own, reasoning on, trusting your own divine light, so to speak, the light of reason, the logo.
Yes, everybody out there listening, you have to take that to heart. Trusting your own mind. I think our culture really conspires against the individual trusting his own mind, and really tries to push you into groupthink and consensus.
Increasingly lately, groupthink is like one of the major problems nowadays. So many smart people that I know, even college professors, are afraid to say what they think. they'll come over to me by the Xerox machine and say something like, Rick, I'm so happy to hear you stand up for that. I don't have the nerve or whatever, and I'm like, what? It's because of people like you that I seem to stand out. Everybody should say what they think is true.
And what that does to the person's self-esteem to admit that to themselves that I'm glad you're doing that. I get that all the time from people too, actors and stuff who are too afraid to stand up. They come to me behind the scenes and they say, "Hey man, I really respect what you're doing." But it's like, well, do you respect yourself now? Because as you said, that competence thing, that's in line with a virtue of objectivism called self-esteem. Which and productivity, which comes from your experience of being able to handle whatever reality is throwing at
Competence.
you. Yeah,
Competence.
that's the
You need to
competence.
cultivate your skills. What is this? This is Aristotle on virtue, right? We're human beings. That makes us rational, social, political animals. So we have to cultivate all of those abilities. Whatever the characteristics are that would make for an excellent version of that, those are the skills we need to cultivate. And how do you cultivate a skill? Through practice. You become a good guitar player by playing the guitar and drills every day, right? So, and what I love about Aristotle, and Ayn Rand is like a kind of Aristotelian champion to me. She's a true Aristotelian. She doesn't agree with everything, but much of what Aristotle said. This idea about relativism and objectivism, what parts of them are true and what aren't. Okay, the concept of value, most postmodernists think there's no objective value, right? There's subjectivists or whatever. But Aristotle said, well, just the concept of good alone is always relative to the kind of thing that something is. What's the identity of that thing? Oh, it's a knife, so it has a function. The Greek word is ergon. What's the function of this object? To cut. Okay, so its telos, its purpose is to cut. Relative to that purpose, sharpness and pointiness and a certain weight and a certain handle make for a better knife as opposed to a worse knife, a dull knife or whatever, right? So we can use the objective facts about what kind of a thing is, its identity. This is the law of identity, the primacy of identity for Ayn Rand, right? To figure out, well, what kind of thing is it? Therefore, we know what good it is. And then the powers or excellences of it are its features that enable it to manifest or excel at whatever it is supposed to do. Okay, so we're like knives in that regard. We're rational, social, political, biological creatures. So what are the things that will have us flourish? What are the equivalents of sharpness and pointiness in a human being? The use of all those virtues, the 7 virtues that Ayn Rand identified, right? So this is my little, I love Ayn Rand. You're right. She's fantastic. And most modern philosophers don't understand her because they haven't really studied her, or if they have, they were biased before they encountered her. I was biased as an undergraduate. Ayn Rand only came up once in an ethical class, a class on ethics, where they kind of did a straw man against her version of egoism. Yeah. And like it was dismissed, and she was presented as if she was a silly stalking horse to make fun of. And I didn't get into her until almost before I met you. I met our mutual friend, Mark Gleason, who started turning me on to Ayn Rand. And I was like, whoa, she's phenomenal. Yeah. She's got, look, there are very few philosophers in the history of philosophy that are system builders. Most philosophers are just system destroyers. They find what's the weak link in the chain and they attack that and they get brownie points for that. But it's not easy to build a system. She's got a spectacular system. I'm not sure I agree with everything, but I'm not an expert on it. But whatever I've read about it, I haven't found a single thing to disagree with.
We're gonna have to have a whole show on what you think may be the errors, because I think you would be one of the few people who could actually make a coherent point. I haven't heard one yet. I wanted to sort of circle back to this concept of transference, though, because when I was going to therapy, my wife's ex-husband was a psychiatrist, and transference was a big notion in psychotherapy. I don't know how familiar you are with it. The idea, from my understanding, is the psychologist takes on the role unintentionally, unconsciously, on the part of the person being on the patient, of the parent or some primary relationship in the life where there was where major errors or major trauma happened, and through that transference, they're able to work out their stuff on that individual. And often, sometimes that means, in a respect, if you can fight with the therapist, if you can stand up to the therapist, you're now sort of symbolically resisting that trauma, and now finding that autonomy that you lost when the trauma took you over and became the thing that dictates your life. Do you think there's any truth to that concept of transference? Do you need transference at all in a therapeutic relationship? I reckon when you're doing philosophy, it's more about dealing with the individual and their capacity to think and manage their way through life. And the trauma that they've experienced with the other person will, as they gain competence with their ability to deal with life, that trauma itself will not melt away completely, but it more or less goes away. You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I don't think it's necessary, and that's your intuition. So I agree with that. But it might be that it kind of overlaps. There may be some kind of like two Venn diagram circles where if the therapist is trying to do that with the client, and there's some other category that's functionally similar to it, that somewhere in the middle, there's utility in that. But I'm not so sure what the others are. But if you recall, when I said there are three basic features of psychotherapy, the first one was to develop a quality relationship, right? You have to lay the groundwork. So
Yeah.
what is happening is that the therapist is now becoming a model of somebody who's healthy, who's a guide to you. So they're kind of like a guru, kind of like a parent or a priest or something. They're in a trusted superior role as wisdom expert or health expert or something like that. And because you've got that going on, you're more comfortable dealing with, and you have some courage and you feel trust, so you're willing to open up. I think it's that other circle that partly overlaps with this transference thing. I don't think transference is a good thing. When I took training in Gestalt therapy for a couple of years, I almost became a licensed Gestalt therapist, but I stopped for a certain set of reasons. But I remember, at least in my training, transference was not treated as a thing to do. It was a risky thing, like involving projection and whatnot, and boundary crossing and all sorts of weird things that might emerge because of this transference possibility. The client starts falling in love with their therapist and wants to adopt them as a guru or a parent, all that kind of stuff. And then the therapists themselves fall into, they succumb to this, like audience capture for big people like Jordan Peterson or something like that, being pulled into the role, right? So
Yeah.
it's really unhealthy and risky, in my opinion. I don't think it's necessary. I think having a good relationship with the therapist is important, but the therapist needs to be mindful of that, keep those boundaries clear, and not be the source of everything for the client. That's what philosophical counselors are very keen on. We are not people's therapists. And one of the reasons why we resist that is because of that association, that set of problems that could happen in psychotherapy.
That's very interesting. We live in an increasingly emotionalized world, right? So I feel like, and you can confirm or deny this for me, I feel like reason has, for decades upon decades upon decades, been marginalized as not only our means of survival, but our means of knowing the world. And it's been replaced by emotions. Emotions are supposed to tell you everything. You're supposed to make all of your primary decisions in life, who you love, what kind of profession you want to pursue, based on how you feel. And psychologists that I used to read when I was going to therapy, one of the most influential for me, who was probably right in a lot of ways, was an ex-Freudian psychologist by the name of Alice Miller. She wrote a book which was originally a book that she wrote for Congress on the United States Congress on child abuse, called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And she eventually ended up doing some very interesting psychological profiles on Hitler and Stalin and Ceausescu and some of these dictators, and on the societies that they came from. But one of her things that I put into full practice in my youth, which I regret entirely now, and I'll tell you why, was this experience that you have to mourn the shame and abuse that you experienced as a child. You simply have to get it out. You simply have to do it. Okay, so when I was in my early 20s, I had a terrible childhood with a stepfather who was a horrible, horrible, horrible human being. A mother who was well-meaning, loved me, and I thank God for that. She was an enlightened witness in many ways in my life, but completely incapable of dealing with that situation, and often relied on me as the emotional outlet for her to help her through the trauma that she was experiencing with this guy. Now that left me with the experience of you can imagine a child being put in a position of combating a man who's incapable of dealing with the emotional situations that he's dealing with, makes him feel quite small and inadequate and afraid of the world, and then resentful after he starts to understand and process that, hey, this adult human being put me in this position before I was ready. Now, under Alice Miller's guidance and a therapist at the time, I had massive confrontations with my mother about this, like massive, honest, come to Jesus moments where I literally hated her. And I fucking held her responsible for everything she did. Now, my stepdad had passed away. I probably would have choked him or done something bad to him at that point. But with her, I thought I was doing the right thing by being straight out and letting that mourning happen. And then when she was 56, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She only lasted 3 years. And I remember, I'm going to cry if I'm not careful here. I remember hugging her and thinking, what the fuck was I even thinking? What the fuck was I even thinking? I didn't have to do that. I didn't need to do that for my mental health. She didn't need to experience that for my mental health or for her to move on. And I had a feeling if I had philosophy at the time, I wouldn't have bypassed the feelings. I wouldn't have repressed the feelings. I would have been able to understand them and contextualize them and deal with my mother as an adult, a flawed adult human being, and probably would have gotten closure long before she died. I know this is probably an impossible question to ask, but do you agree with that concept? I mean, do you?
Not at all. And look, that's one of the reasons why I said there's no theoretical integration. There's no overarching comprehensive knowledge system in the field of psychotherapy. It's like the Wild West. It's almost like the spiritual community or the life coaching world. There's no unifying grand theory. There's no true understanding in that field. So you've got Freudians, you've got Rogerians, you've got all different kinds of, versions of every one of them. It's like being in a spiritual flea market, with Deepak Chopra and this one and that one. It's like, what's holding it all together? So you wound up with a psychologist, who was collecting insurance and then just dumping on you that particular lens that person was trained in. It's not empirically grounded. Well, most of that, and this is psychoanalysis came out of Freud's speculative stuff in the armchair, right?
Not only that, here's what I heard, and you can confirm or deny this. I heard from Alice Miller, this very same person who she rejected Freudian psychology. She was a Freudian, and from Germany. She claimed that Freud recognized that his early neurotic patients had experienced not only deep childhood abuse, but many of them were molested, sexually molested. And because it was the Victorian era, he couldn't posit that to the people. He couldn't popularize that. He couldn't publish that for fear of being censored by society. So instead, he came up with drive theory as a way of displacing the real problem onto the child's primal drives, the Oedipal and electric complexes that they have, this strange incestuous feeling that they have for their parents that are frustrated. All of that was an attempt to hide the actual truth.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's say, the difference between deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive, which is inference to the best explanation, right? So deductive is just where you draw out the stuff that's already implied in a claim, right? Like if someone's a bachelor, then you can deduce that they're not married. Inductive is, oh, I've seen 1,000 ducks. They were all yellow. So the next one will probably be yellow. Abductive is like detective reasoning. Oh, all these different clues. What theory would best explain all this data? That's a really good abductive explanation. I haven't read it, but I think it makes a lot of sense. But what I have read is that there's so many other things like that that have explained many of the theories that became prominent and damaged people throughout the history of psychology. All right. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that that's the case. And this is the point. This is what I mean. Psychology and psychotherapy is presented as if it's science. There's some scientific research going on in the last few decades about which methodologies seem to work. And then there's meta-analyses about what do they have in common and all that. That's what those three things that I said, that's like the core common findings of psychology, is that what works are those three things that I said. Develop quality relationships, generate a mutual understanding of what's going on with the client and what needs to be fixed and how, and then generate tasks and ways to move the client in the direction of functioning again.
Which sounds cognitive, it sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy, basically. And did you ever read Stanton Samanow's book, Inside the Criminal Mind?
No, not yet.
If you haven't read it, I recommend it, because there's an objectivist who does shows with me, Michael Leibowitz, who was a criminal from the time he was 15 years of age, was sentenced to 25 or 30 years in prison for committing a crime. He came out an objectivist and completely changed his way of thinking, in part because he read Stanton Samanow's book, which rejected the old therapeutic notions about rehabilitating criminals. His whole notion was a criminal has never been rehabilitated in the first place. They've been antisocial forever, and they don't think the way a normal human being thinks. And so what you have to do is actually reprogram the way that they think and the way they look at things. And his recidivism rate, when they did his therapy, dropped. I mean, recidivism rate now is somewhere in the 80s or 90 percentile rate. I mean, he got it down to like the 30s or 20s, something like that. But it was a rigorous program of changing your thoughts. That's what I feel philosophy has done for me, in that you start to see, you start to recognize, one, you start to think more clearly, and that enables you to see past whatever obstacles your neurosis, the trauma has put in your way. You start to be able to see past that. And then you see what values, once you see your nature, understand yourself in the world, you understand now what values are good for you. Now, this is what takes years and years and years to trickle down for me, because you start to adopt them at first intellectually, and then as you live with those values for a while, act according to those values for a while, they become automatized in you. And then your way of thinking changes, your way of looking at the world changes. And I got to be honest with you, with all the therapy, there's different types of therapies I've experienced, it's that changing of thinking, that and the rigorous attention to the stuff that you're thinking about, that has actually produced the greatest value in my life and made me more or less, I don't want to say happy, but because it's a word that I think can be interpreted strangely, but there's a sort of contentment or relaxation.
Flourishing is a word that I like,
Yeah.
like when you say, oh, look at that plant, it's wilting. It's not living the life that a plant should live. Same thing. This is the Aristotelian idea. What makes this is a species specific concept, but it varies from species to species. Some plants need more sunlight, some need less, etc. Right? So given our species, we have certain needs, and if they're satisfied, we'll do well, right? So the concept is about flourishing. If you're flourishing, you could be suffering from illness or pain or poverty or all sorts of different things, but still flourishing. If you've got
That's
those
important.
yeah. If you've got those characteristics working, those virtues, those 7 virtues, let's just say, or the self-determination things, intrinsic interest, autonomy, competence, and connection, whatever. There's so many different ways of slicing up the things that human beings need. But you said something about the most important thing being thought and why philosophy plays a role. One of the things I like to say on the very first day of class, when I'm teaching an intro philosophy class, I tell students I went to Catholic grammar school. And I forget, it was in an early grade. I think I was about 10 years old, where they put us through this sacrament called confirmation. And in confirmation, they tell you, okay, you were indoctrinated in the religion, but now you're old enough to think for yourself. And so it's your turn. You have the option of confirming the religion or rejecting it. Nobody ever rejected it. I didn't reject it because there was going to be a party and I was going to get a present. So is everybody else, right? But, so you say, yeah, I confirm. Even by the time you reach adulthood, if you've been indoctrinated in a worldview, to try to reflect on it and step outside of it and look at it rather than looking at the world through it, that's what philosophy enables you to do. So I tell my students, the purpose of this course is to get you to perform a philosophical confirmation. Here you are, you wound up with a million beliefs and values and behaviors and habits and senses of self, commitments, ways of walking, talking, dressing, acting. You don't know how it formed. It was like a cultural download, like you were born a blank disc and a program was dumped on you and it was reinforced with, punishment and reward and all this other stuff. And now here you are. How much of you is you? So Socrates famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living. That seems elitist. I forget who said it. I think some other modern philosopher said it and put it in a better term. I think it was Robert Nozick. Yeah, one of my heroes, also a libertarian, a champion of libertarianism. His book, Anarchy and Utopia, I don't know if you ever read it. It's a must read. Yep. He said, the examined life is at least your own.
I like that.
Yeah.
Although Socrates' quote has helped a friend of mine. I have a friend, used to be a neighbor of mine. He's chronically ill, but now at 79 years of age, starting to flourish because of objectivist philosophy. But one of the things he keeps asking me was, what was that quote from Socrates that you told me? And I would tell him that quote again. And he's like, yes, yes, yes. And he's finding a new life at 79. He's HIV positive. He had full-blown AIDS. He's had every sickness in the book, almost completely debilitated. And yet, philosophy and clarity is taking him out of that. He's not wealthy, he's not rich. He lives actually on welfare. But he's becoming happy. And by happy, I mean thriving, because I don't want people out there to think happy means I feel joy all the time.
Epictetus, one of the great minds in Stoicism, was a slave. Marcus Aurelius, one of the other great Stoics, was the emperor of the biggest empire in the world at the time. Emperor or slave, that's not what your flourishing is contingent upon. It's what's going on in here. So I wanted to add one more thing about the importance of thought and thinking. So philosophical confirmation. Look, we call folk psychology, philosophers call folk psychology, our ordinary understanding of ourselves and each other, right? As opposed to neurology or behaviorism, which is kind of scientific, trying to look under the hood and say, oh, the real causes of your behavior are down here. They're not where you're thinking, right? No, most philosophers accept folk psychology as legitimate, right? I know Ayn Rand does. This is we're operating, and what the language of folk psychology is belief, desire, and action, as opposed to neural firings and stimulus and response and all that nonsense. There's some truth to that on a biological level, and it certainly applies more to animals, other animals. We're still animals, right? But, we understand ourselves and each other in terms of beliefs, desires, and actions. I just want to do a little analysis of this. A belief is a model of reality. It's a thought about what is the case, right? Based on your thoughts about what is the case, and if you got that cultural download and you haven't performed the philosophical confirmation exercise, they're not even yours. The examined life is at least an authentic one. You're in that, what do we call it? Groupthink. The group made you the way you are. All sorts of random TV shows and whatnot. You were enculturated. Okay, so what do you think? And why do you think it? And do you have reason to think it? Is it true? And analyze your thoughts. Why? Because if you have a bad map, you're going to get lost. And your thoughts are your maps of reality. Given your map of reality, that also informs what you should want. So your beliefs inform your desires. Oh, this is desirable. Alcohol, cocaine, video games, whatever it is. These are things I should want. TikTok, selfies, whatever, right? Or Prozac or whatever, right? All the things that I should want. And then that, once you have those desires, you act, and your actions cultivate the kind of crystallized character that you become by repeating actions over and over again. Because as Aristotle said, not only good habits, but bad habits are cultivated through doing over and over again. So you can't change your desires directly. You can't, your emotions are secondary shadow result effects of your beliefs and values and desires. Where's the change going to happen? The control center is in there, in the beliefs. And philosophy is all about 1,000 different psychotechnologies that brilliant thinkers who've done this throughout the history of philosophy have cultivated ways of looking under the hood of thought and introspecting. I know Ayn Rand was big on introspection because it is looking at your own thoughts and examine, what's my premise? What's your premise? How do you know that's true? Do you know it's true? Do you even know what truth is? Right? That's what philosophy is all about. And so if you're going to try to make yourself autonomous, competent, and able to cultivate meaningful intrinsic interests, they should be based on a good understanding of what really matters and what's your values, right? So you can't even have valid intrinsic interests like, oh, I just want to, do cocaine all day long to be happy, right? I find it intrinsically interesting. Well, that's a bad intrinsic interest, right? So that's my little spiel about the importance of thought and role of philosophy as opposed to psychology. Some people need psychological interventions, right? And some people need medication. But the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and the whole industry of psychiatry and psychology is over-medicating millions of kids every day for ADHD as if it's some kind of physiological malfunction, and that's the only way of dealing with it.
Oh, I wanted to talk about that because that's a mega subject that I wanted to talk about before I get to the final topic, which I think will help people even more, is dealing immediately with trauma. But before I even get to that, I wanted to talk about how virtues are habits, just like vices are habits, and it may take you, anybody whose life is sort of out of control, they're not really in the driver's seat, and to those folks I say vice is sort of ruling your life, anti-life habits are sort of ruling your life. It will be uncomfortable to break those habits because you've identified with that way of living. But virtue is good, not in the religious sense. We're not, when philosophers are talking about virtue, they're talking about the means by which you can achieve a thriving life. So it's all life forward. It's not about avoidance. It's not about pushing life away. It's embracing your life and your nature and saying, what can I do with my life and nature to thrive? And those virtues in the 7 virtues of objectivism are, well, you think, you're rational, you're productive, you're independent. These are the virtues that you practice until they become habituated. And when they become habituated, they become automatized, and you'll find yourself thriving much more.
Absolutely. Yeah, people.
I wanted to deal with that. Well, you go ahead, but I wanted to, don't let me forget, I wanted to deal with that over medication and this.
Okay, yeah, just a quick comment about bad habits and good habits. If you feel a kind of weakness as an agent, right, you have very little autonomy, that's like not having very little muscle. So you can't go to the gym from zero when you're overweight, out of shape, you're drinking too much or whatever, you smoke too much, you can't breathe, you challenge yourself. But so you go for a 1-minute walk, you do a half a push-up, do the ones where you lower to the floor and then you get up and you lower to the, eventually you'll build up enough muscle so that you could do full, it's gradual. By doing any little action, no matter what it is, that's novel and that will cultivate the equivalent of a muscle, you will feel some competence. So there's a reciprocal feedback mechanism. right? What is it called? Reciprocal opening as opposed to reciprocal narrowing. Every time you drink too much, you have a bad headache, this, that, you function worse. And so then you need more alcohol to numb yourself. So that's reciprocal narrowing. It's a negative feedback loop. But just by doing little things that are positive and that work, you go, oh, I did that. A sense of accomplishment, a sense of competence. You water that and you keep doing it. So you start out by walking a little, and then you walk a lot, and then you walk faster, and then you jog really slowly. Then you jog at a good pace. Then you run, and then you run, man, run. You do massive sprints, right? And you feel great about yourself. And these are just examples in any aspect of your life, whether it's physical, mental, social, whatever it is, public speaking, it doesn't matter what it is. These are skills, they're muscles, and the more you use them, the more they grow. Negative ones and positive ones. You're absolutely right. Virtue and vice are all habits.
Well, that's a thing of beauty. I love that. And I also wanted to say something that I recognize as I'm working out, because many of you know that I had pretty serious physical issues that kept me from working out for about 7 years. And now I'm back on track. And one of the
Congratulations, by the way, on that.
okay. Oh yeah. I can't. I'm still looking at. I'm still looking at my blue belt like it's the Academy Award. You know, like I can't believe I achieved that. I never thought I would, and so I'm very grateful. But one of the things I recognize, and I want to get your opinion about this. The great thing about working out, the great thing about practicing virtue, is when you're coming out of a stage that's heavy, that's vice ridden, that's where you lack autonomy and control over your life, you experience lots of discomfort. There's a transition process where that's very uncomfortable. But one thing that working out, for example, I think all of you should move. You should start moving today, just like Rick said, even if it's a little bit, move, because your body lets go of what it's not using. And you don't want to reach 50, 60 years of age with your body letting go of stuff, because then it's really hard to
Yeah.
get on.
The longer you wait, the harder it gets. Yeah.
You really risk injury. But one of the things that I noticed about working out, as I'm doing an all out, on the tread, going as fast as as my body can possibly go, I'm like, your heart is in the red zone. It's 190 beats per minute. It's exploding, but you're relaxed. You're content with discomfort. Like, you understand the meaning of discomfort in a different way. When some 200-pound guy is on top of me, when I first started jujitsu and he's putting top pressure on me, it's like the most miserable place in the world. And then you learn how to frame, and you learn how to relax, and you learn how to manage discomfort in such a way that you understand the long-term goal of managing that discomfort is good, is something that's going to take you to a better place, and it's going to make you stronger. That's a mind shift that I think is very important. We've been saying it in so many words, but I think it's
Yeah.
an important thing to bring up explicitly.
I have a quick little analogy I like to use for that. I would call it frame shifting, right? A lot of times it's just the frame that you bring to something. So when I'm training for a marathon, my hips and knees, the heels, my quads, my hamstring, my muscles and bones are killing me sometimes. If I wasn't training for a marathon and I was experiencing those same things, I'd be seriously worried. I'd be going to the doctor. But because I know I'm pushing my body, I'm doing serious hardcore training, I know that those are expected sensations, right? So the frame takes the exact same physical sensations and says, these are okay. Without that frame, I would be like a hypochondriac going to the doctor all the time saying, what the hell's wrong with me? Right. But because you the same thing, it's just shift the frame. So if you say,
That's
I'm
very
making these
important.
changes, yeah, I'm making these changes to help me. So there will be some short-term discomfort, like, okay, I want to start fasting. This strong feeling of hunger comes over my belly. If I wasn't fasting, I think, oh my God, I'm starving. But when I'm fasting, I say, this is good, right? I can handle this. I don't have to act on that sensation. Mental freedom right there. So,
As Hamlet said, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's sort of
exactly.
interesting. Like, I learned from my fellow jujitsu guys, like, you feel like, oh my, I got aches and pains, my elbows are killing me, my hips, this fucking hurts, that fucking hurts. I go onto the mat. Sometimes I'm, just inching my way on the mat. But then you're like, oh, everybody's feeling that way. Everybody's there. Everybody understands it. This is just sort of part of the thing that you love to do, and you do the best to manage it, but you understand now, oh, I live with this and it's okay. That is an important frame to come from because I think it makes you much, much stronger. I mean, I wanted to get to the meta question, but I think, we only have like 10 minutes left, and I wanted to see if there were any questions that anybody out there had, because I know I'm assuming some of you have experienced or trauma in your life, in your early life, trauma that's affecting you to this day. And yeah, and you can use the hand raise function so that we can see you up there. And if nobody's going to ask questions, I still have more that I want to ask Rick about anyway. But I think, and what we can might as well start this topic now. Somebody comes to you for philosophical counseling with trauma. Let's say they grew up like I did in an atmosphere where there was an unpredictable alcoholic, abusive person around. Is there a process that one would go about from a philosophical standpoint to deal with that trauma, which is affecting the person in the adult life? Clearly they habitually reacted to something. It became the vice now that is in control of the rudder of their mind. How would you get them off of that?
That's not easy. And, it depends on how pathological a client seems to present themselves as. If somebody seems to be like really in need of some kind of serious psychotherapeutic intervention, we might just refer them to a psychologist. So we try not, like, that's not the primary role of philosophical counselors. But if we agree to see them, our job is to do like things like I said, encourage them in little ways with some frame shifting, some understanding. We just want to find out what's really going on with them so that we both understand it and try to give them opportunities to understand it better themselves and to say what things can they do to process it. And there's no universal. I mean, look, in general, there are no universal algorithms for anything. There are useful heuristics. So I have a vast toolkit, and if I get to know a client, I'll see what I think might be helpful depending on what's going on with that person's mind. But the first thing we need to do is just to establish some kind of, it's almost the same as in the therapeutic relationship. I mean, I do philosophical therapy if it seems to me that a client needs it. So the same thing, I want to establish a comfortable therapeutic kind of atmosphere, the client relationship, and then cultivate mutual understanding about what the causes are and what are the options for changing it, and then experiment. We do experiments, try this on, try that on, and that's it. It could be simple things. Sometimes it's very pragmatic, like, what? You're stuck in your mind. You need to become more embodied. You need to do exercise. It depends. Like, I have a client who came to me, this is something interesting from objectivist. So that kind of trauma is one thing, but I had a client come to me who was in the grip of skepticism, right? Which is now becoming popular nowadays with the matrix and all this kind of stuff, simulation and all these things, right? So this client was maybe 21 years old, completely immobilized by skepticism.
Wow.
Yeah, completely. I
Wait,
mean,
there was a philosopher who decided not to speak at all, who was a skeptic. Do you remember the name of this philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher?
Pyrrho.
Was it Pyrrho?
Pyrrho was the most famous ancient Greek philosopher who was a skeptic. He was a kind of founder of skepticism. I don't know if
he decided not to speak at all.
I wouldn't be surprised. But Andrea raised her hand. But I'll just say that it varies from person to person. So, but what I did with that guy, I gave him a bunch of arguments and reasons in favor of or against skepticism, and I encouraged him that the reality of your hunger means that you have to eat. The reality of your exhaustion means you have to sleep. I had to get him out of his mind and into his body. And those are the kinds of it varies from person to person. What you think is going to work, and you make an experiment, you see if it works. Like I said, everybody's pathology, if it is a pathology, is unique. So there's no universal medicine. But in general, the kinds of things that Ayn Rand would advise, what positive things can you start doing, baby steps to turn it around? Where are the knots? Look at them, examine them. Are those premises true? Does it have to be the case that you're still holding on to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So we challenge the client. We're not there to make the client happy.
Yeah, those positive feedback loops cannot be underestimated. And now, how do we, let's see, Andrea raised her hand. Lou,
Yes.
do you, oh, are you there? Go ahead.
Yep, I'm here.
Go ahead.
So you're talking about trauma. I've been through the EMDR therapy, cognitive, and the DBT therapy. And the only thing I've ever learned is mindfulness and how to ground myself. That is basically over the last 20 years of therapy that I have taken away, other than they just sit there and listen to me or they lecture me. So what would philosophy help with the trauma? What's one thing that I can do just to start baby steps?
Well, it sounds like you're already doing two really good things that I would say are even better than just baby steps. If you're practicing mindfulness and doing grounding, what kind of grounding are you doing? What grounds you? Do you have some kind of embodiment practice? What I generally try to advise people is what my friend, a cognitive scientist and philosopher, John Vervaeke, great guy, he calls an ecology of practices. We're holistic beings. We live on multiple dimensions. So there's 4 different kinds of knowing. 4 P's, he says: propositional, procedural, how to ride a bike; participatory, you participate in things like dance or exercise, and then you know what it's like; and then you have perspectival knowledge, and there are ways of shifting perspective. So that's all mental. That's all in the mind that Mark and I were talking about in this space. But then we're also embodied beings. So yoga, tai chi, martial arts, running, exercise. If getting your body moving, all those things are very helpful. Everybody needs to cultivate an ecology of practices and experiment with which ones are empowering to you. It could be all sorts of different things. It depends.
I wanted to jump on that too, Andrea, because you're a complex being, and mindfulness is great because I think it gets you conscious of what you're thinking, and you need to be conscious about what you're thinking. It gets you conscious about what you're doing, and you need to be conscious about what you're doing, which is very good. Grounding also brings you into the moment. And if your issues are with anxiety, you know what I started doing once I was getting anxiety attacks, and grounding wouldn't even help me. Like, listen, touching things and making sure I was in the present moment wouldn't help me. What finally helped me with anxiety was it's embracing it and saying, oh, my body is clearly telling me something that I need to know. And instead of rejecting it and being afraid of it, I'm going to dive into the wave. I'm just going to say, what do you want? What do you want me to know? What do you want me to know?
And it depends. I'll add something about the anxiety. You probably know this, Andrea, or is it Andrea, that there's
Andrea.
Andrea, link between anxiety and breathing. So as a I've taught yoga for decades. I've been practicing it most of my life. You can calm yourself down by breathing long, slow, deep breaths, and by holding the in-breath for a few moments, and by holding the out-breath for a few moments. It has a self-anesthetizing effect. But sometimes, like Mark just pointed out, you don't want to mask the anxiety. The anxiety is a sign that there's something wrong in the system. You want to pay attention to it. You want to explore it. And mindfulness is good for that. But sometimes this all varies from person to person. How much reality can you take all at once, right? So sometimes you need to kind of regulate your emotions. Sometimes you need to look at them and see what's behind them. Mindfulness is a great thing for that. The way my friend John Vervaeke says, meditative practices are like taking the glasses off your cognitive equipment, your emotional, your whole psyche, looking at it rather than looking through the world, looking through the world, like taking the glasses off. You say, oh, look, they're foggy, they're scratched, they're warped, right? That's what the problem is. And then you try to clean them and put them back on. right? This is what mindfulness is capable of doing, a kind of figure ground shift where you examine yourself. Where are the knots? Do I still need to hold them? Why am I still holding them? What's the glue? What do I need to do? You need to trust yourself too. And the more that you work with yourself, the more you develop this competence and autonomy and trusting your own intuition and your knowledge and your reason. Mark, you told me you had a hard ending in a minute from now.
I
That's
do.
still true?
I just want to address this still, and then I think Ali has a question, and then we'll conclude after that. But I could go on with you forever because you're so goddamn interesting, or I should say, dad damn interesting. Yeah, Andrea, right?
Andrea. Yeah,
Andrea, you
sorry, I
said
did that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the solution with respect to philosophy, especially objectivism, which is a philosophy I prefer, is a rather long, slow journey. But it starts with mindfulness. It starts with mindfulness, consciousness about who you are, what you think, questioning those things, as Rand would say, checking your premises and weeding out the errors that create the conflict within you, because oftentimes what creates a conflict is errors in your thinking, errors in your perception that
False
you need.
beliefs.
Yes, that you need to start weeding out. And reading philosophy will enable you to do that. Reading, particularly objectivism. I would start with Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, because I think it's very accessible. Objectivist epistemology is a little less accessible, a little more
Or even
academic.
somebody with great trauma might want to start with Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
There's that too, because I'll tell you what, I started with Man's Search for Meaning, and logotherapy actually did really help me deal with immediate anxiety. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz. He's figured out a practical system of psychology to help people deal with anxiety. And if anybody knows what anxiety is, it's a guy who went through Auschwitz.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I wish I could encapsulate for you the solution, but the solution is study and applying what you're studying.
Practice. Yeah, practice.
I can,
Ali, is that Ali? I haven't seen you in a while, Ali.
go ahead, Ali.
It's yeah, Rick, it's been a while. You can see my background has changed. It's been a crazy last couple of years. Okay, so my question is for both of y'all. So I've actually had to change therapists because it was quite frustrating because every one of them would say that helping people is like should be my number one go-to to handling my own anxiety and PTSD and all that. But I feel like it doesn't help because I'm trying to find something that works for me, but helping other people, I feel like, yeah, I'm helping somebody else, but how does that help me? And I was wondering if y'all had some like tips for that stuff like that.
Lots of thoughts about that, but Rick, you can go ahead first if you want.
Well, look, for some people that works because getting outside of your own head might be just a kind of temporary reprieve or something like that, but it's not really treating it's masking the symptom. It's not addressing the source, right? That's number one. Number two, philosophically, I'm sure Mark would agree, altruism is not universal medicine that's applicable for everybody or even helpful. It depends. Voluntary altruism is a good thing. It's called philanthropy, right? That's elective. Right. But so we have our hairs on our neck and our antenna come up whenever we hear you have to help others as a way of helping yourself. No. Put the oxygen mask on yourself first. And if you have any extra help to give around, that's optional. It's not required. I don't think it's therapeutically wise. There may be in the case that the therapist might think, I need to get this person out of their own head, and it might work. So there may be some cases where that's useful. But in general, I don't think it's very wise.
Yeah, so that's huge in the Alcoholics Anonymous and AA. That service to others is a massive part of the program. And look, alcoholics, in my view, this is my view, are huge narcissists. And so the practice of getting them out of their narcissistic self-obsessions and into recognizing that other people exist in the world is actually a fairly healthy thing. getting somebody who is in a narcissistic self-obsession to recognize there are people in the world that they have to be considerate of. You don't necessarily have to serve them, but to be considerate of. Because I don't think you should gain your self-esteem or sense of worth by quote unquote helping others. You should get yourself a sense of self-esteem by creating value. And that, like the invisible hand of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, it helps people. You create value, you end up helping people.
That's a collateral benefit, though. It's not the purpose. It's
right.
not the purpose.
So
I think helping yourself is primary.
Helping yourself by finding a way to create value
in your own life. Yes.
In your own life, in your own
intrinsic interest thing. Intrinsic interest. Find something that you love. Right, that's the other model. Ikigai is a Japanese word that's the equivalent in Japanese of raison d'être, your reason for being. So this is an interesting model. It's like a Venn diagram with 4 circles. What is it that you love? What are you good at? What will pay you well? And what is there a need for in the world? If you could have all 4 of those intersect somewhere, and that's the sweet spot, right? But one of the most important things are, what do you love? That's intrinsic interest. If you find something that you love and you're really good at it, that's bringing value to you.
It's bringing value to you, and being well paid for it means that somebody else values it as well. And so you're creating value in other people's lives.
Yeah. And if you care about helping others, you're serving a need in the world, because if they're paying for it, then you're filling a vacuum with it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but Rick, I'm so glad that you hate that. Well, I don't know, hate it may be a strong word, but that
yeah, you know, my antenna goes up whenever I hear anybody telling me that my worth is contingent on what I do for other people who are just like me.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a contributor. I actually think altruism is especially in the way that it's practiced is a major contributor to mental illness, in my opinion. I think it breaks down your confidence in your own mind. It makes you feel guilty for being successful, even creating value. You're put down for it. Loving stuff is, you're only considered to love something if you sacrifice and give up and lose. None of that is valid. I think it's terribly destructive to the human soul. We'll take one more question, and then we got to go, guys.
Just sorry about my English, my mother tongue. My question is, I think one of the big problems that the person's suffering has already been in this state for a long time. And I think it's like a snowball. It adds layers, and the actual brain, it changes physically. So instead of being an integrated system that you can look at it clearly through introspection, has become a tangle of things that makes introspection difficult. And I think that doing things like going to the gym and writing, for example, it helps. But I feel like it's something that you put over the real problem. You're not actually dealing with the problem. So how you think we can actually deal with the problem and not just trying to live our lives like the problem is not there, because it's there and affects you either you want or not.
Yeah, that's why I was saying, for example, I can use a breathing exercise that will calm my nerves. I'm regulating my emotions. Sometimes that's useful and important, but it's only treating the symptom, not the cause, right? And a lot of therapy is designed to treat the symptoms, but it's not intelligent enough, or for whatever reason, to go at the causes. And that's the whole thing about objectivism, and Mark saying the causes are in your beliefs. They're in your thoughts. They're in your head. That's where you have to go. What is the problem? Take the glasses, take your whole mindset off and look at it. You have to look for the causes. What's the premise of your suffering? Is the cause still there even, or are you just holding on to some unhealthy habit from the past? And, that varies from person to person. But sometimes people need, like, training wheels on a bicycle, right? You might need training wheels, a temporary crutch or some kind of support while you're trying to do the deeper work. It depends. It varies from person to person.
Yeah, there's no easy way out of that. The problem that you have that's sticking with you for many, many years from trauma that you experienced will, I'm gonna say this and it's gonna sound awful in a way, will always be there. It's always gonna be there, like a scar. If you get cut with a sharp sword, the scar is going to be there. The question is, can you navigate your way around the world with it? Can you still thrive and be happy with it? Can you contextualize it in such a way? That doesn't mean compartmentalize. It means contextualize it in such a way that it no longer actively harms you, but in fact informs your life in many ways. And look, you do the exercising and the breathing to get the emotional, the panic out of the way so that you can think. And then you can think and ask the questions that Rick was talking about. Is this situation present in my life now? Is it something in the past that I'm holding on to? Oftentimes we identify with our trauma. At least I did. I identified with it, and this is going to sound really weird, but it was like if I killed that trauma, that thing I identified with, it was sort of like killing me. If I let go of my anger or my fear, something terrible was going to happen to me because that's who I identified with. But as Rick said, it was a false me. It was other people who had said things about me or done things, and that I concluded at a time when I didn't have the context to be able to understand what was happening to me. So yeah, do those things that you need to do to keep your body healthy, to feed yourself the proper values, and to slowly but surely gain control over the emotional life. And what I mean by control is don't let it demand take over your life. You see through it and into it. What's its source? Is it still there? If the source is still there, what can you do about it? Because you are free. And that's an important thing to realize, because oftentimes in these emotional situations, we don't feel entirely, as Rick was saying, autonomous. We're not in command. We're not in the rudder of our own ship.
Learned helplessness. That's a habit also, that it can be broken.
It can be broken, and it also has to deal with changing frames, as Rick was saying. There's a book now by Don Watson called Effective Egoism, which I think is a very good guide to valuing your life, to teaching you how to frame your outlook on life in such a way as to value your life. I can't tell you how powerful that is for overcoming what you feel is unovercomable. You're in the midst of trauma. It's been bothering you for a long time. It sets your life patterns in a lot of ways, and it feels like it's unstoppable. It's not. Shifts of perspective, which it's not just a matter of saying, I believe this now. It's not affirmations. It's none of that. It's a willful resetting of your mind and your outlook. And it's not comfortable. It's not immediate.
It takes time, just like transforming your body from being overweight and out of shape into an athletic body takes time. It's not going to happen in a few weeks or even a few months. But you work at it and you'll see the changes gradually. It's a matter, and the longer that you've been carrying something and identifying with it, the more it became like a barnacle aspect of your personality that Mark was saying. I identify with that. It was by my sense of identity. I'm a victim or whatever it is. I'm a trauma victim or whatever. It takes time to change it. The core of you is your sense of self. That's the hardest thing to change, but even that can be changed.
And one of the most powerful things that Rand taught me, and this takes a long time to incorporate too, Manu, is at first I thought this was a flaw in objectivism. She didn't identify with pain. She didn't identify with being a victim. Never. And I first thought, well, fuck, what the hell's wrong? She's compartmentalizing. She's avoiding something, because all of us experience pain. You can't deny pain. And when she said pain was metaphysically unimportant, I'm like, what human being says pain is metaphysically unimportant? Right now, Jordan Peterson is making millions of dollars telling everybody Pain is what we experience all the time. In fact, some great, spiritual teachers like Buddha would talk about pain and suffering is what life is. And here's this philosopher who has the audacity to say bullshit to that. What she means by it is that life is always what you should be aspiring to. That you're not indifferent to pain. You just understand it's not your destiny to be in pain. Your destiny, if there is such a thing, I don't like to use the term in its literal meaning, but your goal is life and thriving, and that's what you should always be going for. Pain happens. My fucking everything hurts right now, but you know what I'm more interested in? Learning jujitsu. And when I do that, the pain becomes less material. When I'm striving to make myself healthier as a 60-year-old man, it's like and I want to throw up. It's like the pain is just a part of getting better at what and striving for life and being aspirational. And there's a lot of philosophers that hate that. Human beings are endlessly ambitious. They're never satisfied. Yes, that's right. And that's what's good about us, because we're always growing. We're always aspirational. I remember I asked this philosopher friend of mine, because I used to go to philosophical counseling too a long time ago, Rick, from an objectivist philosopher. And I was like, I'm always unhappy as an actor. I'm never good. I'm never reaching what I want to reach. And he showed me this picture of Mercury not a picture, a statue of Mercury that he had in his office. And Mercury was doing this. And he said, see, Mark, here's you, and here's your potential. And every time you go like this, your potential goes like that. Every time you reach up, your potential gets higher and higher and higher. And that's beautiful. It's a thing to embrace. It's something now that our culture is afraid of and hates. They want
Your reach should always exceed your grasp.
Yes, and that's okay, and that's great. And it's great to fall when you're doing that, because you're becoming better. Now, I don't know how any of that, if any of that helps you or inspires you, Manu. I hope it does. But understand that the road is going to be, it's going to be long. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be releasing things that you are used to. And sometimes it feels really weird to do that. But the end of it all will be a sudden realization 10 years down the line that, oh my God, I'm
just going to say something like this, Mark. As a martial artist, it takes years to get somewhere. I have a Tai Chi friend, a teacher, who says it's 5-year increments for growth in Tai Chi, right? So what you should think about when the road ahead seems daunting is, where will I be 10 years from now if I don't start changing my behaviors now? And if I start working on it now, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, I'll be a black belt, let's just say, or whatever. But I have to do the work. I've got to get my ass kicked a lot of times in the dojo. That's part of the fun.
Yeah, and Steve Martin, the great comedian, once said when he picked up the banjo, he wanted to get good at the banjo. He's like, shit, if I do this every day for 5 years, I'll be pretty good. And it's true. If you practice virtue every day for 5 years, practice reason, practice productivity, practice treating yourself as a value, practice living an aspirational life, asking yourself questions, figuring out what it is you want and need in the world. It's going to be hard because you've been taught all of those things are bad and means you're a selfish asshole. It's not true. It means you're a person trying to live, and you deserve to live, and you deserve to be happy. And you do that, it's going to take a lot of practice, but 10 years down the line, you're going to discover that, oh, I'm happy, even though people are yelling at me and screaming at me and calling me this name or that name. I'm still happy.
Yeah, because you know what they're like? They're like dogs barking at the caravan as it passes by in the night, with music and partying going on in the caravan. That's what those people are like. That's a frame to put on it.
That's a great frame to put on it, because it shows exactly what the losers of social media are all about. The screamers, the yellers, the people who hate. Manu, does this help you? Does this bring you some value? Think about it. Think about it. Oh, guys,
It
I have a
does.
heart. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just it's because some people can do that. I mean, I can look clearly at my thoughts, and writing helps because it kind of organize everything. But I feel like some people are so confused inside their own heads. Their own heads work against themselves. So I think for some people it helps, but I mean, for people with worse state of mind, even if they have purpose in their life and they do things, they just going through life like I'm happy for having this, but actually in their heads they're all confused. So it helps me, but I think I
Look,
just have to figure out
I,
the confusion.
we live in a culture, that doesn't respect the mind anymore. So it's not, and they don't like people being aspirational. There's a certain aspirational culture out there that says go for what you want, but it's equated with selfishness, it's equated with bad things, and our culture looks down on it. Our culture doesn't give you the tools to use your mind to navigate the universe. It doesn't. It tells you your emotions are the things that you should use to navigate the universe. And so it's no wonder people are confused and upset, because there's no, once your emotions are running the ship, especially with the way so many of us are wired with early trauma, it's running it into the ground or into a maelstrom. It's not helping you. So you have to sort of reject the culture's focus on emotional life, respect your emotional life as information about what's going on inside of you. You need to respect that, but reject the culture's rejection of reason, and now use thinking as your means of navigating the world. Rand always said, never do what you feel, do what you think. And I have to say, the older I get, the more I agree with that. But guys, I have a heart out. I could talk about this stuff all day. Rick, you're one of the most compelling people to talk to. You are an amazing teacher. I wish I had you as a teacher when I was in college. I might have
Wish I
stayed in
had you
college.
as a student.
I would have stayed. I would have stayed and I would have taken your classes even when I didn't have to take your classes, because you're amazing. You're amazing at explaining things and making things very clear. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I have mutual respect for you as well, Mark. I'm
Thank
honored to be your friend, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you. And guys, for joining us. I hope you got some value out of this today. We'll talk about it on Patreon today. I promise I will be on Patreon later today after I do some stuff. If you have questions, we'll talk about it there and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks for joining us today. Lou, thank you for all your help.
Yeah.
You are a dad's gift to the Pellegrino world. And the rest of you, love you, and I'll see you out there on Patreon in a few hours. Peace.